Years ago, a man was systematically executed by his own family because he wouldn't stop being annoying. It sounds like a dark joke or a throwaway line from a prehistoric sitcom, but it is a documented reality of how our ancestors managed the first human crisis, the problem of the difficult personality. If there were no prisons, no police, and no written laws, how did ancient humans actually punish criminals? Why did a society that needed every single hunter to survive decide that some people were simply too expensive to keep alive? More importantly, if you were a victim of a crime in the Pleistocene, who exactly were you supposed to call for help? And if the punishment for every serious crime was essentially social death, how did our species manage to evolve the concept of mercy? These questions lead us directly into the work of Christopher Boehm, a biological anthropologist who spent decades analyzing how small-scale societies handled deviance without a central government. Boehm's research, particularly in his seminal work Hierarchy in the Forest, answers the first question by pointing toward a mechanism he calls the reverse dominance hierarchy. In most primate groups, the biggest, meanest individual gets the most food and the best mates. They rule by sheer physical intimidation. But humans did something different. We realized that while one man might be stronger than any other individual, he is not stronger than three men acting in coordination. This realization created a system where the group, as a collective, became the alpha. But what happened when someone inside that group decided the rules didn't apply to them? How did the group decide when a mistake became a crime? And if gossip was the first stage of a trial, how did they ensure the verdict was actually fair? The answer, quite often, was that they didn't, which is the first uncomfortable truth about ancient justice. Before a spear was ever leveled or a stone was thrown, the first layer of punishment was a weapon we still use today, gossip. In a small band of 20 to 50 people, your reputation was your bank account, your health insurance, and your literal life support. If you were lazy, or if you consistently took the best cuts of meat for yourself, people started talking. This wasn't just idle chatter, it was a distributed social trial. Robin Dunbar's research into social grooming suggests that gossip evolved specifically to allow humans to monitor and regulate the behavior of others in increasingly large groups. By talking behind someone's back, the community was building a consensus. They were aligning their stories, making sure everyone agreed that grog was becoming a problem. But if gossip failed to change grog's behavior, what was the next step? And how did they escalate the pressure without causing the entire tribe to descend into a bloody civil war? This brings us to the second stage of prehistoric punishment, public ridicule and the leveling mechanism. Anthropologists studying the Kung San people of the Kalahari Desert, specifically the research of Richard Borsche Lee in the 1960s, documented a practice called insulting the meat. When a hunter returned with a massive life-saving kill, the group wouldn't praise him. Instead, they would mock him, calling the meat scrawny or hardly worth the effort. They did this specifically to prevent the hunter from becoming arrogant or demanding special treatment. It was a preemptive punishment for the crime of being too successful. But if a person pushed back against this mockery, or if they tried to claim authority they hadn't earned, the ridicule became sharper and more personal. If a man became a bully, the tribe would mock him to his face during communal gatherings. Imagine the psychological weight of the only 50 people you know on Earth laughing at your failures in unison. But what if the offender didn't care about being laughed at? What if they were physically dangerous or prone to unprovoked violence? That question moves us toward the most terrifying tool in the ancient toolkit: ostracism. In the modern world, being canceled or ignored by a friend group is painful, but in the Paleolithic, it was a death sentence with a very slow fuse. Richard Wrangham, in his book The Goodness Paradox, explores how this functioned as a form of human self-domestication. If the group decided you were no longer a member in good standing, they didn't have to kill you. They just had to stop helping you. They wouldn't share their fire. They wouldn't watch your back while you slept. They wouldn't help you carry a heavy kill. This was essentially the ghosting of the Stone Age, but with literal predators lurking in the shadows. A human being alone in the Pleistocene was a human being who was already dead. They just hadn't stopped breathing yet. But how often did this actually happen? Did people really just watch their cousins starve to death? And if someone committed a crime so heinous that ostracism wasn't enough, like murder, how did the group carry out an execution without becoming murderers themselves? Wrangham's research suggests that the invention of language allowed for proactive aggression. This is the ability of multiple people to sit in a circle, away from the offender, and calmly plan a murder. In his analysis of hunter-gatherer societies, execution was almost always a collective act. There was no executioner, because that would create a cycle of blood feuds. Instead, the entire group, or at least all the adult males, would agree on a time and a place. Often, a close relative of the offender would be the one to strike the first blow. This was a specific legal strategy to prevent the offender's family from seeking revenge later. If your own brother agreed you had to die, who was left to avenge you? This leads us to a disturbing realization. Our ancestors didn't just punish criminals, they biologically pruned them from the gene pool. But as populations grew and humans began to settle down into the first permanent villages, did this system of social pressure still work? How did justice change when you lived in a town of 5,000 people instead of a tribe of 50? And what happens to the concept of gossip when you no longer know everyone's name? The transition to agriculture around 10,000 years ago changed the math of punishment forever. When you have grain silos, permanent houses, and land ownership, moving away is no longer an easy option for the group or the offender. This is where we see the birth of formal, written law, not because we became more civilized, but because we became too crowded for gossip to be effective. The first written code we have isn't actually Hammurabi's. It's the Code of Ur-Nammu, written in Sumer around 2100 BCE. For context, that's about 3 centuries before the famous one you learned about in school. What's fascinating about Ur-Nammu's code is that it was surprisingly focused on fines rather than physical violence. If you cut off a man's foot, you paid 10 shekels of silver. If you broke a man's bone with a club, you paid 1 mina of silver. It was a restitutive system. It was about making the victim whole rather than making the offender suffer. But why was a society 4,000 years ago seemingly more lenient than the ones that followed? And if money could solve most crimes, what happened to the people who were too poor to pay? This brings us to the inevitable question of Hammurabi's code, established around 1750 BCE in Babylon. This is where the famous lex talionis, or law of retaliation, comes into play, the eye for an eye philosophy. But if you look at the 282 laws carved into that 7-foot diorite pillar, you'll see that justice was not actually equal. The punishment depended entirely on your social status. If a gentleman knocked out the tooth of another gentleman, his own tooth was knocked out. But if he knocked out the tooth of a commoner, he just paid a small fine. It's a stark reminder that as soon as humans invented the state, they also invented tiered justice. This raises a new question. Was the eye for an eye system an escalation of violence, or was it actually an attempt to limit it? Before Hammurabi, a tooth for a tooth might have turned into a life for a tooth if the victim's family was powerful enough. The law was a ceiling, not just a floor. It said you can only take an eye and no more. But how did they prove someone was guilty in a world without forensic science? And if there were no witnesses, how did a Babylonian judge decide who was telling the truth? They used something called the trial by ordeal. If a man was accused of a crime and there were no witnesses, he might be told to jump into the Euphrates River. If the river conquered him, meaning he drowned, his accuser got his house. If the river let him go safely, the accuser was put to death for lying. This seems insane to us, but to the ancient mind, the river was a sentient deity that knew the truth. It was a way of outsourcing the burden of proof to the gods when human evidence was lacking. But what about the crimes that weren't caught in the act? How did ancient people handle the cold cases of the Iron Age? And as we move into the Roman and medieval eras, why did the punishments become so much more theatrical and cruel? Why did we move away from the civilized silver fines of Ur-Nammu and toward the public disembowelments of the Middle Ages? The answer is power, and specifically the need for a king to prove he owned your body. As states became larger and more impersonal, the reverse dominance hierarchy of our ancestors was completely inverted. Power now flowed from the top down. Punishment was no longer about restoring the community's balance. It was about the king's peace. In Roman law, specifically the 12 tables from 450 BCE, we see a brutal pragmatism. If you were caught stealing at night, the owner could kill you on the spot. If you committed arson, you were burned alive. This wasn't about cleansing the gene pool like the hunter-gatherers. It was about state-sponsored terror to keep a massive population in line. But even in this brutal system, there were anomalies. Why were some criminals given the option of exile? And how did the Romans handle a criminal who was a citizen versus a criminal who was a slave? The distinction between citizen and person is perhaps the most significant legal invention of the ancient world. If you were a Roman citizen, you couldn't be crucified. That was a punishment reserved for the unpeople, slaves and rebels. This brings us to a specific historical example, the poena culae, or the punishment of the sack. If you killed your father, parricide, the Romans believed you had violated the natural order so deeply that you shouldn't even touch the earth. You were sewn into a leather sack with a live dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, and then thrown into the sea. The animals were chosen for their symbolic meanings of betrayal and lack of parental respect. But why go through all that theatrical effort? Why not just a quick execution? The answer is that the punishment was a ritual. It was a way of deleting the criminal from the spiritual world as well as the physical one. This leads us to a darker corner of archaeology, the bog bodies of Northern Europe. When we find bodies like the Tullen man who died in Denmark around 400 BCE, we see something that looks like an execution but feels like a sacrifice. He was found with a noose of braided leather around his neck, but his face is incredibly peaceful. Forensic analysis of his stomach shows his last meal was a specific kind of porridge made from seeds and grains. Was he a criminal being punished or a lucky volunteer being sent to the gods? This is where the line between law and religion becomes completely blurred. In many ancient Germanic and Celtic tribes, there was no separate legal code. The rules were the gods' rules. If you violated a taboo, you weren't just a criminal. You were knifing a person who had lost their human status. You could be killed by anyone without penalty. But how did these tribes transition from this lawless state to the complex systems of the Middle Ages? And why did the wergold, the man price, return as the primary form of justice in Europe after the fall of Rome? The wergold was a return to the Sumerian idea of fines, but with a Germanic twist. Every part of your body had a specific price tag. In the Salic law of the Franks around 500 CE, if you cut off someone's hand, it cost you 100 solidi. If you cut off their thumb, it was 30 solidi. If you cut off their pinky, curiously, it was cheaper unless it was the finger used for pulling a bowstring, in which case the price went up. This was a very practical way to stop families from killing each other in endless cycles of revenge. If you could pay the man price, the debt was settled. But what if the crime was so bad that money couldn't fix it? What happened to the unforgivable criminals? And as we look back at this long, bloody history, from the annoying man in the Pleistocene to the poena culae of Rome, what is the one thing that never changed? The thing that never changed was the role of the audience. Whether it was the gossip of 50 hunter-gatherers or the thousands of people gathered to watch a crucifixion in the Roman Colosseum, punishment was always a performance. It was a signal sent to everyone else. This is what happens when you break the circle. But here is the most counterintuitive fact of all. In 1992, a study by anthropologist Polly Wiesner on the Jew Hansi people showed that, despite having no police and no jails, their murder rate was actually lower than many modern American cities when you adjusted for population. Their justice system of gossip, mockery, and the occasional collective execution was actually more effective at preventing violence than our billion-dollar prison industrial complex. Why? Because you can't hide from 50 people who have known you since the day you were born. Does this mean ancient justice was better? Not necessarily. It was deeply personal, often unfair, and incredibly cruel to those who didn't fit in. But it was also human. It was based on the idea that the criminal wasn't a stranger. They were a brother, a cousin, or a neighbor who had broken a promise. As we moved from the personal to the impersonal, from gossip to diorite pillars, and from insulting the meat to throwing people in sacks, we lost the ability to see the criminal as a person. We traded the intimacy of the tribe for the efficiency of the state. But did we ever truly leave the reverse dominance hierarchy behind? Or is the internet just a globalized version of the gossip fire, where we collectively decide who is knithing and who deserves to be pushed out of the camp? Archaeologists recently discovered a cave in Spain, where a Neanderthal child with a severe brain deformity had been cared for and protected for years before they died. This child couldn't hunt, couldn't gather, and would have been a drain on the group's resources by any logical metric. Yet they were fed, carried, and eventually buried with care. This suggests that even before we were human in the modern sense, we had a concept of mercy that ran parallel to our concept of punishment. We weren't just a species that killed our bullies. We were a species that protected our vulnerable. The justice of the ancient world wasn't just about the spear, it was about the circle. And the moment you were kicked out of that circle, you weren't just a criminal, you were a ghost. If we look at the history of the world through the lens of a courtroom, we see that the laws didn't get nicer as time went on. They just got more complicated. We traded the quick, consensus-based execution of the tribe for the decades-long civil death of the modern prison. But if you were an ancient human, which would you prefer? Would you rather be mocked by your family until you changed your ways? Or would you rather be a number in a database of 1,000 commoners whose tooth doesn't matter to the king? The answer depends entirely on how much you value your reputation versus your life, because in the ancient world, those two things were exactly the same. It's a haunting thought, especially when you realize that the first trial in human history probably didn't happen in a court, but around a fire, while the defendant was sleeping just a few feet away. Our ancestors didn't need a judge to tell them what was right. They just needed to look at each other and nod. And in that silent nod, a life was either saved or ended. The diorite pillars of Babylon and the written codes of Sumer were just the echoes of those first hushed conversations. We like to think we've escaped the brutality of our past, but our brains are still wired for the reverse dominance hierarchy. We still use gossip to destroy reputations. We still use ridicule to level the powerful. And we still, in our darkest moments, wonder if some people are just too expensive to keep in the circle. So the next time you hear a piece of gossip, or you see someone being mocked on a global scale for a social mistake, remember the hunter-gatherers. Remember the Kung San and their hardly worth the effort meet. Remember that for 99% of human history, justice wasn't something you got from a lawyer. It was something you earned by being the kind of person your tribe didn't want to kill. And if you couldn't do that, no amount of silver in Sumer could save you. Because at the end of the day, the oldest law on Earth isn't an eye for an eye. It's don't make us do this. The proof of this isn't in a history book, but in our own biology. Scientists have noted that humans have remarkably small canine teeth compared to our primate cousins, and our skulls have become more feminized and less aggressive over the last 100,000 years. This is the goodness paradox in physical form. We literally bred the violence out of ourselves by executing the bullies, generation after generation, until only the cooperative were left. We are the descendants of the people who knew how to follow the rules. And more importantly, we are the descendants of the people who were organized enough to kill anyone who didn't. Which brings us back to that man 40,000 years ago, the one killed by his own family. When researchers examined his remains, they found he hadn't been killed in a fight. He had been executed with a single, precise blow to the back of the head while he was crouching down, likely eating. It wasn't an act of passion, it was an act of house cleaning. It was a cold collective decision made by the people who loved him most because he had become a threat to the only thing that mattered, the survival of the group. If you want to know how ancient humans punished criminals, don't look at the pillars of Hammurabi. Look at that single, clean fracture on a prehistoric skull. It is the definitive, haunting proof that for our ancestors, the greatest crime wasn't murder or theft. It was being the kind of person who made the group feel unsafe. And in a world without walls, the only way to be safe was to make sure the person who scared you never woke up again. Do you think our modern impersonal justice system is actually an improvement, or have we just traded one kind of brutality for another? I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you'd survive in a reputation-based society, or if you're as grateful for the anonymity of the modern world as I am. If you found this dive into the dark origins of human order fascinating, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the forgotten mechanics of our species. We have a lot more ground to cover, and the circle is always open for those who want to know more.